Our speaker is Harriet Kelsall, and she's the founder and the chair of Harriet Kelsall Bespoke Jewellery. She did start her business from her kitchen table over 22 years ago, so she is a pro in all of this, what she's doing now. And it grew from the kitchen to more than 40 people and 3 studios, so it expanded a lot. And she has won multiple awards for what she's doing. She is the deputy chair of the National Association of Jewelers and is a director for the British Hallmarking Council. She also has been the director of the Responsible Jewellery Council, and she is a regular keynote speaker on ethics and has advised the government on jewelry skills as part of the Creative and Cultural Skills Academy. She's very passionate about helping creative business to flourish, and she wrote a book on the subject, which is called The Creative's Guide to Starting a Business, How to Turn Your Talent into a Career, and won the 2019 Business Book of the Year awards with that. So I'm really happy to have Harriet Kelsall here. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Eva, for that extremely generous introduction. And thank you, everybody, for inviting me here to talk to Lucy Cavendish College attendees. I feel extremely privileged to be here. I was just going to say as well, I'd love to know where you're watching from. I always think it's wonderfully powerful, these strange days we're having, that we can do these talks over the internet. So I'd love to know where you're coming from. So do let us know that as well. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about dyslexia, or as I like to call it, 3-dimensional thinking. And I'm also going to be talking about the advantages of dyslexia, which I think are often overshadowed by the fact that many dyslexics struggle to spell or handwrite or read. And this talk's also sort of threaded through with some of my own story about how I learnt about my own different brain, and I hope that that I can pass on some tips about that too. And as Eva said, there'll be time for some questions at the end. And also, I just suppose I wanted to say before I start that in this background of Lucy Cavendish thinking so much and moving great mountains about diversity and inclusivity, it's great to be talking here about brain diversity as well, which I think is one of the many things that needs lots more talking about. So yeah, Einstein said, "Everybody is a genius, but if you judge a fish on its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing it's stupid." And Einstein was apparently dyslexic. A friend of mine who is in learning support says that if she doesn't wear her glasses, she instantly becomes illiterate. And some people need easy to understand tools to be liberated, like glasses or things printed on special colours of paper. But others need quite different tools and methods in order to read or write fluently. I really confused my own teachers at school back in the 70s and 80s because I was really good at maths and art and music and told great stories that people wanted to listen to. And I seemed fairly bright, but my handwriting was almost illegible. And I always routinely got 0 out of 10 for my spelling tests, time and time again, even if it was the same set of spellings. So they decided I must be playing up and being naughty, which I sometimes was, but not very often and not in that way. And I now know that I've got a brain difference called dyslexia. To quote the NHS website, dyslexia is a common learning difficulty that can cause problems with reading, writing and spelling. And it's estimated that 1 in 10 people have dyslexia. So the word dyslexia comes from the Greek, of course, which means it has dys meaning difficult and lexia meaning reading. And it was first used in 1887 by the German ophthalmologist Rudolf Berlin. So you could say it was first identified at that point, but it isn't just a modern issue because symptoms of dyslexia could not really have been discovered before that because only the very few educated people could read at that point and the general population couldn't. So it was only as people became widely literate that this brain difference underlying dyslexia was articulated. And people often talk now about specific learning difficulties, SPLD, instead of using the word dyslexia. And there's always controversy about labels for these things. But I think that dyslexia is the label that the general public still uses when they're talking about it to non-experts. And things have changed with our understanding of these learning difficulties, because now we realise that some dyslexics are good readers and some can even spell. So the old definition of dyslexia doesn't really hold up anymore. So dyslexia was, and still is, very much seen by the wider world as a disability, a difficulty to try to work around and fix. To quote the famous Thora Hird line from Victoria Wood's play, "In my day, there was no such thing as dyslexia. You were just sat at the back of the class with raffia." And with such a bad reputation, it's almost inevitable that the focus on it continues to be about the negative aspects of the brain difference, the things that don't work like other brains. When I say negative, I mean negative in the eyes of conventional thinkers, or as I call them, linear thinkers, the people without dyslexia. So I see it differently. I see dyslexics as three-dimensional thinkers, or 3D thinkers, and I can't see why everybody thinks of dyslexia as such a disadvantage. My daughter, who's also dyslexic, has decided that the 3D thinker label is quite good, and she thinks that the things that those 3Ds might stand for are design, decision maker, and determined, or maybe maybe decisive, designer, and disruptor. So I want to talk here about what this different kind of dyslexic brain means for a person, and also the genuine and often measurable advantages of being dyslexic to our society. But first, let's have a look at, oops, where am I? At this. So the definition here, we've got, this is a quote from Snow, Burns and Griffin from 1998. Dyslexia is a neurobiological in origin, meaning that the problem is located physically in the brain. Dyslexia is not caused by poverty, developmental delay, speech or hearing impairments, or learning a second language, although those conditions may put a child more at risk for developing a reading disability. So anybody can have dyslexia. It's a physical difference with the brain, and like lots of physical differences like hair colour, skin colour, or the way you look, dyslexia often runs in families. The Davis Dyslexia Association says that 40% of siblings of kids with dyslexia also have some reading issues themselves. So kids with dyslexia, or 3D thinkers, won't recognise the words that they're reading as easily as linear thinking kids, even words they already know and have seen quite a few times before. They'll often struggle to decode the words, as well as understanding how a new word might be read aloud. So in simpler terms, we struggle to recognise common word patterns and remember how they're supposed to sound, even when we've seen them quite a few times before. And this means we have a lot of trouble actually understanding what we've just read, because the experience of decoding each word is such hard work for us that we can easily then forget the sense of what we're reading. So we don't get that flow that linear readers experience when they're reading something and understanding it as they go along. And so even now at 49 years old, I often have to read important things in quick succession to actually understand them. And when it's something that I find really complicated, like a legal document with more unusual words in it, or complicated sentence structures, this can take me a very long time. So if we were to maybe oversimplify the brain, as in this diagram, this is from brainmadesimple.com, and split the brain into two, and we can see that the left-hand side of the brain, in very, very simple terms, controls the right-hand side of the body, and that side of the and the right-hand side of the brain controls the left-hand side of the body. And the first part is more academic, and the right-hand side of the brain is actually generally more creative. That's where creative things happen. So just like dyslexia, another thing that affects a lot of people is being a right-brained learner. And this refers to people who are very visual and tend to store their information in picture form. Perhaps it helps them to visualize pictures when they have to learn a list of information or how to spell a word. Recently, researchers have been making strong connections between being dyslexic and being a right-brained learner. So please note, though, that not all dyslexic people are visual learners. Some rely heavily on sound memory or have different strengths. And there are still lots of theories and research going on with scientists looking at problems like an ability to hear rhythm and different connections that might make sense of some different aspects of dyslexia. But the point is that if you aren't strong with words, your brain discovers other ways to learn, and it will use its strengths to work things out, whether those are visual or auditory. In my experience in the fields that I've worked in, all of the dyslexic people I've met have been right-brained learners who favour visual things like mind maps to understand things and images to help them remember them. And that's the kind of brain I'm going to talk about today, the dyslexic visual learning brain. Now, nobody completely understands exactly how the dyslexic brain works compared to the normal brain, and I am definitely not a brain expert. So this next part is just an idea or a hypothesis put together from different papers and sources that I've read and experiences that I've had, but I find it helpful, and I hope you'll find it helpful too. So this is how I've come to understand how dyslexic brain works for somebody who's also a right brain thinker. So the left cortex and the right cortex carry out different functions. Parts of the left handle linear information, like a line of words on a page, and is the most appropriate side of the brain to use for reading, writing, and spelling. And the right-hand side of the brain is good at creative stuff, and it works with patterns, spaces, areas, and sees things as pictures. And then there's apparently a corpus callosum, the bridge of nerve cells between the two sides, and that part of what that does is decide which side of the brain to send a task to. Perhaps one of the main differences between dyslexic, who's a right brain thinker, and a so-called, oops, sorry, I've just skipped a slide. Sorry, where was I? But yes, perhaps one of the main differences between a dyslexic who's a right brain thinker and a so-called normal brain is that the information is processed by a different part of the brain. Visual dyslexics seem to use the right-hand side of the brain to spell and read, and actually those kinds of linear things are actually done much better with the left-hand side of the brain. So the right-hand side of the brain is really good at many things, but it's really not very good at spelling, reading, writing, and grammar. It can't understand parts of speech or letter ordering for spelling, and it reads words as a line of drawings, and it has to be taught the meaning of that drawing rather than as a lineup of sounds. So the dyslexic brain might try to understand the word carrot in just the same way that it would see the picture carrot and interpret it by recognition and visual elements. So every word to a very dyslexic person has to be learnt from scratch without being able to rely on building up sounds like blocks of understanding. And so then every sentence is often processed in the same way as a series of pictures that have to be taken in visually one at a time, unless they've been seen many, many times before. And so this makes reading or spelling really hard. So if you remember, I said that the dyslexic brain underuses the left-hand side of the brain, whereas the right-hand side of the brain is highly used and exercised and developed. So dyslexics are usually particularly good at using the right-hand side of the brain. Now, the thing is, personally, I don't really think that dyslexia is a disability, and I'm definitely not alone. I believe that this strange and different way in which the dyslexic brain works often results in an extremely valuable skill set. And so perhaps that overuse of the right-hand side of the brain, if you can call it that, can lead to exceptionally creative thinkers, creative problem solvers. So perhaps dyslexia gives us lot a kind of superpower in solving problems creatively. And now there are computers and spell checkers, and we all can carry these around in our pockets because they're so small and clever. We can all speak emails or use Siri and similar, and there's voice recognition, that's software that can change your voice into type and read it back to you. So technology is solving all of the difficulties that dyslexics have on a daily basis, and kind of maybe leaving dyslexics with only a huge pile of actual advantages rather than disadvantages. And I think that's never been truer than now. The trouble is, I also notice that I rarely meet a dyslexic person who doesn't undervalue their creativity. This 3D thinking comes so naturally to them that they almost don't notice that it's different from other people. And they find it hard to realize this is special and useful and not something that other people are always capable of. They feel like all they do is just connect stuff together and it comes really naturally to everyone. But actually, it really doesn't come naturally to linear thinkers at all, not most linear thinkers. So dyslexic people often undervalue their amazing problem solving and creative abilities. And I've spent most of my adult life around industrial designers, engineers, computer engineers, and jewelry designers. And I'm also a bit musical and have lots of musical friends. And in each of these areas, there have been an unusually high proportion of dyslexic people, of three-dimensional thinkers. And guess what? In each case, the really good innovations in those fields are often made by those three-dimensional thinkers, by the dyslexic people. So I often say to people that some employers need to have a think about their attitudes when, for example, they look at a CV, because somebody who's made a few spelling mistakes or with slightly clumsy grammar, depending on their role, might just be worth working with, depending on their role. It's tricky because dyslexic people can write that thing and read it again and again, and they actually just don't see the mistakes. Their brain automatically skips over them. But they will spot the mistake in your design that you've all missed, and it's going to make it unmanufacturable. And they will maybe spot the gap in the market that everybody else is missing and overlooking with conventional marketing. I could spend all day listing the brilliant musicians, writers, and creative geniuses in our society with the gift of three-dimensional thinking, who are also dyslexic, including highly successful actors and musicians who we've got here. We've got Agatha Christie, John Lennon, Cher, Keira Knightley, Jennifer Aniston, Whoopi Goldberg, Marilyn Monroe, Will Smith, Oprah Winfrey, and including apparently Einstein, Michael Faraday, Alexander Graham Bell, Leonardo da Vinci, Picasso, Rodin, Warhol. So I think three-dimensional thinkers or dyslexic people are really important, just as important as linear thinkers, as everybody else. But actually they're also necessary in our society. There's a reason we haven't all died out yet. I think that without them, it would be a poorer place. And I personally don't believe that these people would still have been creative geniuses without having had the kind of brain that also made the world call them dyslexic. And furthermore, it's a little known fact that dyslexic people make excellent entrepreneurs because they often create innovative and successful businesses, as they tend to tackle business problems differently than other people. I'm not saying they're always easy to work with, but they are often natural problem solvers and natural delegators because they tend to know their weaknesses, who can often think in multiple dimensions all at once. So here are a few names of famous entrepreneurs who are also dyslexic. We've all heard about Richard Branson being dyslexic because he's a great, ambassador and talks about that. Henry Ford of the Ford Motor Company. I'm going to pronounce this wrong, so apologies. Ingvar Kamprad, who started IKEA. William Hewlett from Hewlett Packard, Steve Jobs, we all know about from Apple, and Steven Spielberg from DreamWorks, and the amazing Anita Roddick, who founded The Body Shop, which was hugely innovative at the time, and Walt Disney. So these people were or are all dyslexic. I could go on. But have you noticed something about these particular entrepreneurs? They've all succeeded in incredibly innovative and unusual ways. The 3D thinker in them makes them approach things differently and often in a way that can lead to great success. They don't tend to be bound by the way things have gone before or by learning by repeating what's gone before. And they tend to be able to innovate because they can naturally see things in a multidimensional way. For this reason, they also often have strong visions of how their businesses could be because they're generally very visual, and a strong vision is also definitely needed for success. In 2007, Julie Logan, a professor of entrepreneurship at Cass Business School in London, released the results of a study of 102 entrepreneurs in the US, showing that 35% identified themselves as dyslexic, which is strikingly high when compared with the fact that only 10% of the general population are identified as dyslexic. Personally, I think that figure would be much higher if that was repeated, looking specifically at entrepreneurs in creative industries. So knowing all of this, I want to know why every parent of a dyslexic child doesn't cheer when their child's discovered to be dyslexic, when they're picked out as a three-dimensional thinker or an innovator, or a potential inventor, a potential entrepreneur, as somebody who might end up on this list. Personally, I find that every 3D thinker that I've ever worked with has had the kind of brilliance that they bring to their role in the world. And often what that actually is a sort of holistic problem solving, which I liken to the layers of an onion. I think that when dyslexic people are trying to solve a problem, they start at the outside layer of the onion and they think about it all at once. They can be difficult to follow at these kind of stages because they feel to other people like they're all over the place, but actually they're going around the outside. Sorry, I don't know why my thing keeps doing that. They're going around the outside of that onion, and then they'll go step down by a layer and step down by a layer. And so when they do get to the center of that onion and they actually have solved the problem, they've usually got a very properly rounded solution. I think that that sometimes when conventional thinkers solve problems, not all of them, they often solve things in straight lines. So they'll think about the marketing and then they'll think about the design. And sometimes it can be difficult for them to join those things up, whereas dyslexic people may take longer to appear to solve the problem, but then often solve it in what I like to think of as a three-dimensional way. So there are still a huge number of people who think that learning and education are all about words, reading and writing. And of course it has to be in many cases. It's particularly the case with certain subjects. And you can understand that because that's the way in which they learn things with their particular types of brains. Linear thinkers or normal non-dyslexic people find reading and writing so easy that they just can't help people thinking that people who can't spell are deficient and maybe secretly think they might be a bit thick. It's not really their fault. They just can't understand or believe our brains are so different because we look the same as them from the outside. And they think this despite the fact that these same dyslexic people invented the computer that they might be working on. Perhaps because they subconsciously think spelling and reading and writing is even more important than three-dimensional thinking and innovation, because in education it often seems that way. Personally, I think that it doesn't help society to think this way, and it can be causing all kinds of problems for dyslexic children and the adults that they become. At my senior school in the early 80s, they didn't test for dyslexia or entirely believe in it. But after two girls arrived who had previously been diagnosed as dyslexic at their former schools, my school let them go into specialist lessons every week with a dyslexia specialist teacher. And not only that, they also had extra time in exams. And you'd think that would be a really good thing for them. But actually, everyone in my class was polite and never said anything negative to them. But I always felt that with the other kids, there was like a silent understanding that they both must be a bit thick because they couldn't spell or read or write as well as other people. And their parents used to talk about how their daughters had a mountain to climb in order to be as good as everybody else. Consequently, I feel like these two girls carried their dyslexia around with them like a crutch, and they unwittingly lent on it as an excuse why they didn't need to be upset if they weren't as good at something as everybody else. Why they maybe didn't need to drive themselves as hard as they could because they had this disability. And this was perhaps why they felt they wouldn't achieve what the rest of us were apparently destined to achieve, why they might not go to university, but they might instead take a vocational route, and why they would settle for something else, for relying on others than being self-driven. But when I think with my adult mind back to those two girls, I'm astonished that nobody ever talked about what they were so brilliant at. Claire was an amazing violinist who went on to make violins. And Julie was deeply creative and a natural innovator, designer and artist. And she now runs a successful pottery school in Croatia, putting things together that used not be put together. But their strengths were things that weren't really talked about back in those days. And these strengths certainly weren't linked with the amount of time they had to spend out of the classroom working on their spelling. Personally, I think that back then both would have been far more successful if maybe they hadn't been labelled as having a negative disability that undermined their confidence, compared with the others of us. Oh, sorry, I've done it again. I don't know why I keep doing that. So personally, I feel like maybe they were silently and passively undermined by the silence of many of their peers and of the parents of their peers. there's still something big and nasty holding some dyslexic people back. Bruce Jenner, the famous US track athlete who's dyslexic, said the biggest problem with dyslexic kids is not the perceptual problem, it's the perception of themselves. And I'd go further than that to say that actually the biggest problem for dyslexic kids is that their perception of themselves is a reflection of the perceptions of their parents and of their peers and of the parents of their peers. Society's perception of dyslexia or three-dimensional thinking, I think, can be wrong and damaging and can be holding people back. In the 1980s, in many ways, I think of myself as one of the lucky ones because my school didn't diagnose dyslexia. I only more recently, I wish it was recent, I only more recently discovered I was dyslexic in my mid-20s when my late mother-in-law, who was a specialist dyslexia teacher, diagnosed me. And my teachers in their senior school were almost exceptionally good teachers. My English teacher used to mark my essays with spelling mistakes, probably eight or nine spelling mistakes on every single line, which is almost as many as there are words. But she'd still give me an A because she said, this isn't going to happen in the exam, but she wanted to show what she thought what I was actually saying was really good. That kind of marking was really rare back then. So I was very lucky to have that. And there were a few other teachers, though, mainly in my junior school, actually, who almost destroyed me at my school for my inability to spell and who punished me for not being able to write clearly and mocked me in front of the class for not being able to spell the word put, which I still really struggle with, actually, and who accused me of plagiarism when I wrote what she thought was a really good poem. And she said to the class, "You're far too thick to have written that, so you've obviously..." There were, however, happily some excellent teachers around, as I've mentioned, who recognised and encouraged my strengths in art and maths. And so I still had some self-confidence left to build upon. And I began privately to work out ways to succeed. And I discovered a few tricks that I could use in a way that sort of bluffed normality. So I started to discover, for example, that if I had to learn a long Shakespearean quote in English, I'd make up a song about it. And even though that song was way longer than the quote, I found that the extra dimension of music helped my brain remember it. Sounds bonkers, but it worked. My handwriting was really pretty much legible, but my dad had also noticed how fascinated I was when my mum did calligraphy as a hobby. So he bought me a beautiful blue italic copybook and told me to approach writing like calligraphy. He didn't tell me it was to improve my writing. He just I thought it would be fun. And I began to see the forming of every letter as a tiny piece of art. For me, this changed my life and means that I can still write legibly to this day. And what he'd actually done without realizing it was give me the ability to continue to use the right-hand side of my brain for my writing by playing on its strengths and help me enjoy the formation of characters. And this was hugely helpful for me. So it's a tip I often give to parents of dyslexic kids. And the next life changer for me came when I learned to touch type in my sixth form. If we dyslexics do a course or an online course and are determined to learn to touch type and put the time in to learn this, we often become really weirdly good at it. And I think it must be something to do with the added dimension of using the pattern on the keyboard, playing on the strengths of the right brain again. I'm not sure why, but so far, everybody I've met who's dyslexic and can also touch type has said to me that learning to touch type changed their life and made them able to communicate with words for the first time. I can now see that these kinds of skills, calligraphy and touch typing, were using highly multi-sensory methods, perhaps that would be good to bring to the curriculum for the benefit of all pupils, not just for dyslexic kids, and not just as an option for those who choose it, especially these days. And these skills maybe would benefit everybody. So back when I was at school, I opted for subjects where words and grammar didn't matter so much. And I studied industrial design at university. I still ran into all sorts of difficulties with words. And I remember once running out of a statistics exam because my eyes just wouldn't read the words in the correct order. It was as though the words kept moving around on the paper and I couldn't read them. Luckily, my maths teacher sat down with me in the foyer before I left the room for 10 minutes and told me to go back in and read each word one at a time. And actually, I ended up being the only student to score 100% in that exam, despite the loss of time. The reason I'm telling this is not because I'm really proud of it, but because If the words jump around, and if you have that problem, it really doesn't mean you can't do the actual thing those words are saying. You definitely can. You just need to learn ways to tame those words and keep them still long enough for you to take them in. Another important step for me was when my mum decided to get my IQ tested. And it was actually not low as she feared, it was actually high. And this proved to me that I wasn't thick. Although, to be honest, I didn't really know what this meant at the time, IQ. So it didn't really bother me that much either way. But what it did do was it helped my mum, who'd really been worrying that I was actually just really thick. She's not dyslexic. And I think it led her to start to value my intelligence because my IQ was what she perceived as high. And she began to understand that just because I couldn't spell, maybe it didn't mean that I was someone to be ignored academically. And this was a big step for her and for me, because it really helped my self-confidence as her confidence in me grew. So I always recommend getting an IQ test for a dyslexic child. I eventually got a first-class degree at Brunel University with high marks, hooray! And I believe that confidence that helped me achieve this was within me, partly because I had something to prove to myself, and partly because I wasn't held back by being a diagnosed dyslexic who decided they could never be as good as everybody else. I fought hard to try to be as good as everybody else because I could see in the linear subjects I had problems, but I also allowed myself to flourish at my strengths. So I went on to found my jewellery company, which has won some awards for innovative business ideas and blue sky thinking and breaking the industry mold and stuff. And by coincidence, not by design, it turns out that in my team of 40, we have at least 20% who turn out to be dyslexic. And my ex-husband is dyslexic, and he's an award-winning film sound engineer who's been nominated for BAFTA awards. And I also managed to write a book about starting a creative business, which was published last autumn and went on to win an award, something I never could have dreamed I'd manage as a child, with my 8 spelling mistakes on every line. But the reason is I wrote it because I was solving a problem. I felt there wasn't a single good book about starting businesses that spoke to my kind of brain. So I solved this problem by writing one and made sure it was also available as an audiobook for people like me. It wasn't a quick or easy task, but it was worthwhile and with great success in the end. So really, my dyslexia has been much more of a help than a hindrance. And I would say I'm not doing too badly. But one thing I want to say about that story about writing a book is that what I did was I tap into something else. Rather than thinking, oh, I'm writing a book, I've got to write it one word at a time, I thought of it as solving a problem. And when I changed that mindset, I managed to overcome the problem. So sometimes dyslexic people are very often good at solving a problem, and they'll do whatever it takes to get through that problem. So I want to draw some conclusions from my experience of dyslexia, and that are things that I've seen in myself and so many of my friends and work colleagues. And I want to draw on the good parts of my own experience as an undiagnosed dyslexic, together with the brilliant help that kids can get today. And all this means, I hope to open your eyes to being able to see dyslexia not as a real disadvantage, although it does have disadvantages, but to really understand the huge advantages that it brings, that we're just as valid as people who aren't dyslexic. I can't even say it, you see. My late mother-in-law was a specialist dyslexia teacher, and whenever she would diagnose a dyslexic child, she would say, oh, brilliant, lucky you, we've discovered another dyslexic genius. Don't get me wrong, because there's still a long way to go, because whilst diagnosis and assistance for dyslexic children is brilliant these days and learning support is excellent, time and time again, when I meet these wonderful kids, I find they're so shocked when I tell them that they should be thrilled to be dyslexic. They're still growing up thinking it's a hindrance in their lives. And I regularly have their parents in tears when they hear that I believe dyslexia is fundamentally an advantage these days. I really do. And no one's ever pointed it out to them before. And I really think that we will improve our society if we can all view dyslexia or three-dimensional thinking a bit differently and a bit more positively. And I mean all of us, not just teachers and parents of dyslexic kids, but also their classmates and their parents. We need to get over this view of, oh, our poor son's dyslexic, I'm so upset because he's going to have to work so much harder than everyone else. It's not helpful to the child, and it's not helpful to the society's confidence in that child. And it's not strictly true either, because although it may be the case in more linear subjects where they'll need certain tools to help them through, in other subjects they will sail through with a kind of ease that conventional thinkers can only dream of. We all need to be a bit more like my mother-in-law and see these three-dimensional dyslexic thinkers as useful and important part of society that they've proved to be. Unlike my experience, these days a diagnosis can be a very good thing because we've moved on. The extra time that this diagnosis gives children is hugely valuable. Many kids go on nowadays and are relieved to find out that it's in no way a reflection of their intelligence, as they used to be led to believe, and that there's often a specific reason why some aspects of learning are more challenging for them, and they can often gain strength from understanding this. We need to tell dyslexic kids, and everybody else for that matter, that the interesting and different way in which their brains work means that they could be the next Einstein, Warhol, or Steve Jobs, build their confidence in their strengths, find workarounds to unleash their phenomenal abilities opened up by 3D thinking. And I think that dyslexic kids need to be appreciated in the subjects they excel in and gain confidence. But we all have a part to play in this. Don't just leave it to the teachers. They may be brilliant. And don't we just think about that at the moment, trying to homeschool our kids. But they can't tackle this on their own. Last half term, my closest and oldest friend and I met up, and we've been best friends, if you like, since we were 4 years old. And she later started talking to me about a friendship that her daughter had and that she'd made in her class, and she was concerned because this child seems wonderful, except that she gets 0 out of 10 for her spelling tests, and so she's concerned about her daughter becoming friends with this child who she concludes must not be very clever. She was wondering about whether she should discourage this friendship. And I sat there open-mouthed, and I had to remind my friend that this was her and I when we were 5. And when we were at school together, she'd completely forgotten I was dyslexic and how my spelling used to be. And she was quite shocked when she realized her unfounded prejudice. So even my best and oldest friend was unknowingly becoming part of the process of undermining the confidence of that 5-year-old in her daughter's class. And, you know, Florence, her daughter, certainly isn't going to make a friend with somebody who isn't intelligent. She should have realized this, and she knows this now. Obviously, I've told her. But obviously, I'm happy to say that they have decided that they can be friends now. But, you know, I think it's amazing that you have to remind somebody who knows you that well to think about this differently. So we have got a long way to go. Similarly, perhaps I had a chat with a group of my son's friends a couple of years ago, back when he was in year 5 or year 6, because I overheard them saying that one of their other friends had to go to the thick room, meaning the learning support room, to learn how to use tools to help him with his SBLD, his learning difficulty. As you can imagine, I had a long chat with them, and now they no longer think of this in the same way. But, you know, this is a brilliant school that has an excellent provision for learning support, and still this is what the culture surrounding dyslexia brings. So if you're a linear thinker and a parent of a 3-dimensional child, you may think your child is very bright and also a bit strange and crazy. And this is kind of true, because in some ways, when we're compared to linear thinkers, we are a bit strange. When we're thinking around those layers of an onion that I mentioned before, we often, as I said, seem to be all over the place, and it can be hard for people to follow because we don't go in a straight line. So I feel like when the common thread amongst dyslexic people that I've noticed, these 3-dimensional thinkers, is that they're not limited by what's gone before, as long as they still have their confidence. They won't be limited by their own abilities in the way that others are. And there's an incredible boundlessness to their creative thinking. If they come up with a problem that they really want to solve, they won't be floored by it, but will naturally do all that it takes to help solve their problem, which is amazing. Many parents of dyslexic kids that I talk to explain aghast that they just cannot understand why their child does so badly in certain subjects at school, when at home they've become an expert in certain things and have constructed huge areas of knowledge around what everybody else might think is baffling, like they know every single football player's name and spelling and ages and every single car engine type and whatever it is that interests them. They develop a huge knowledge around that. Because the thing is, when a dyslexic child or adult really wants to know something or solve a problem, really nothing will stop them, and their energy is extraordinary. but they have to want to solve that problem. So here's a quote to leave us with, from Steve Jobs, as you probably heard before. Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, the ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify or vilify them. But the one thing you can't do is ignore them, because they change things. They push the human race forward. And whilst some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius, because the ones who are crazy enough to think that they can change the world are the ones who do. Right, so that's the end of the talk. So I'm not sure how we're going to fit in, but I'm really hoping that you've been asking lots of them, and I really hope that
loads of questions. Thanks so much, Harriet Kelsall. This was amazing. I think everybody learned so much. I know loads of people in the room as well, which is great, which also reflects the interest in this topic.
Right.
So it's important to people, and thanks so much for giving this talk. So we have a lot of questions, we have a lot of comments. So a lot of people find themselves in what you talked about, which is really nice to see, and loads of compliments as well. And maybe we go through the questions first, although the compliments are nice, but the chat will be saved, so you can go through that one as well later. So we maybe go through the questions first. For everybody else, if you will not have your question answered, the questions will be sent to Harriet as well, so she will be able to receive your questions. So don't worry. Who started sharing the screen? Adam Mills. Okay, sorry. Okay, cool.
Would that be helpful?
No, it's all good. I think it'll be good. So a lot of questions are around the definitions a bit. So the definitions about dyslexia and maybe what else it includes as well. So for example, Paul was asking, he was diagnosed with a central processing disorder, dyspraxia, and is that connected? And is there any advice on websites or support? So maybe some other people have some ideas about that too. Please put that in the chat.
Yeah, I don't know much about dyspraxia. I know a little bit about it, but I'm a bit disinclined to talk about it because I'm definitely not an expert in dyspraxia or in dyslexia. I'm just somebody talking about it from my But I do gather that some experts do believe that they're linked. I do know there's quite a lot of support out there that I've completely gone blank on. There's a particular organisation that is relatively new on that Richard Branson's got involved with. And I think that even learning support professionals are not all aligned in what they define as dyslexia. Most learning support professionals these days don't like the term because it's non-specific, whereas they like to split it into different bits, I think. Please correct me if I'm wrong. I'm hoping that a couple of learning support professionals are watching and can tell me that. But yes, I believe that that's actually, it is linked. There is support out there, and there is an organisation that Richard Branson's involved with that is offering loads of help, and I can't remember the name of it, which is not very helpful. But when I do, I'll tell Eva, and hopefully she'll be able to tell you.
Probably the same direction is Daphne asking that originally or earlier on the dyslexia was also, or one part of dyslexia was having a poor eye to ball coordination, and that probably goes in the same direction. She's asking if that is still considered part of it, but that's probably in this crossover, or
yeah, I'm not sure. I know my daughter had that same issue, and she is also dyslexic, so that seems like more than one person's got that link. But I think that when kids are very young, I think that it's very difficult to determine whether they're dyslexic or not. I know that there's, oh yes, thank you, someone just said Made by Dyslexia is the organisation. Thank you, yes, that's the one. I gather that they're offering quite a lot of support. I just saw that flash up. I don't see the messages, and that one flashed up like Inspiration. So yes, sorry, what was I saying? Completely lost my thread. Oh yes, the eye thing. And so I think that especially when kids are very young and they're not reading and articulating well yet, the right thing to do at first is to look at the eyes, because often there are eye issues there as well. But yeah, I'm afraid I'm not an expert in knowing exactly how that's defined.
Cool. Then there are a lot of questions about giftedness and dyslexia. So is that connected? So that is that Judith is asking if there's a high overlap between dyslexia and intellectual high giftedness, or and Robert is asking if all 3D thinkers are dyslexic. And there was another one, the advantages. So is it this three-dimensional thinking, is that connected to just dyslexia, or would you say that it is across multiple neurodivergencies?
I think that being a visual thinker, being what I was calling a right brain thinker, is not only exclusive to dyslexics. I know several people who are very visual thinkers and definitely are not dyslexic because they spell everything perfectly, and one of them is my son, and it troubles me greatly that he can spell so well. It's the only one in the family that can. It's terrifying and wonderful. Somebody needs to, goodness me, it's very important. But yeah, it's definitely not true that every visual thinker is dyslexic by our definitions of dyslexic that the learning support people are using these days. When my daughter was diagnosed as dyslexic, she's 11 now, so it's relatively recent, we were told that part of what they look for is a gap between how bright they are, their IQ, or however you like to define it, their intelligence, whatever you want to call it, and how they can communicate that intelligence through words and whatever difficulties they're having. And it's that gap that I believe is dyslexia, because some people just may not be very good at stuff, and there may be no difference there. So when teachers notice that is different, that they're noticing this kid is very good in some ways but isn't writing 3 lines of nonsense, but they really seem to understand every word, that will start to be a warning that maybe there's an issue there. So I think it's often about a gap between what they should be able to do and what they can actually communicate. I think that's how things moment.
There was a brilliant question about communication, actually, which I liked a lot. David is asking, if the world was 80% dyslexic, what would be the preferred communication method?
Wow, I love
that's a good question.
I'm constantly at everybody about, let's do everything in video. But and it's so strange now with these times of with awful COVID times we're in, but everybody's using video so much more. We may not like to be as glued to our screens as we are, but actually suddenly we're overcoming a lot of those things that we used to be a bit scared of, about making a video clip, a teacher making a video clip, instead of necessarily always writing down a great big document to explain what they want to do, or a worksheet. And I think this strange time where we're sort of glued to our weird screens and all going ever so slightly crazy, I think is a good time for us to stretch that communication into that different way. Yeah, I don't know. What do you think, David? What do you think people would, how do you think people would communicate if it was, if we were 80% dyslexic? What's your thought on that?
They would have to unmute himself if he wants to answer that.
Well, I'm not dyslexic, so I really don't know. But I think I understand what you're saying. A more rounded communication that gives you a bigger picture than something that's just narrow words on paper.
Yeah. And it's different for different people, and I think it's true for many people that some people want it written down, some people want a video clip, some people want a diagram, some people want a mind map. You can't always do all of these things, but isn't it great that we've got so many tools, so much more thinking about that these days. I'm trying to remember another name of an organisation that I did an interview for the other day, and I will remember it soon. And he's a guy who called Darius, and he's got something that's actually very supportive for adults, because I do think that sometimes there's not as much support for dyslexic adults as there could be. And he's trying to sort of help with this way. He has a method of it's sort of a bit like a cross between a mind map and a list, which weirdly, coincidentally, was actually quite similar to what I do to sort of communicate to myself and keep track of all the things I've got to do. And so I do think there are tools out there, and there's a guy I know who has been to speak at Cambridge University before. I don't think at Lucy Cavendish, and his name's Nigel Lockett, and he's known as the dyslexic professor, and he is actually a professor of entrepreneurship, and a great guy. He's I think he teaches at Glasgow, I think it is, and he's looking to try and sort of work out what tools, what tools there are that are useful for adults who are dyslexic. I mean, as I was saying, it amazes me, what we can do on our phones now, the planning that we can do, and the way that we can think creatively. I mean, I don't know if any of the rest of you are using Teams, Microsoft Teams, but we're finding that I didn't realize at first that you can add all these tabs, and there's this amazing app that has changed my design team's perspective on working from home, because it's so good for three-dimensional thinkers. And it's an app called Mural, and you can add a tab to it. You can just use it online if you don't have MS Teams, and you can invite people to do a brainstorm with you, and everyone can put post-it notes all over the place, and then they can import images, and then you can color code them and put them all over the place. And there's another one called Meister. I don't know why I find that title really funny. Anyway, it's not Meister, it's Meister, because it has to be German. And that is really good as well. It's an app, again, you can add to your MS Teams tab, and it enables you to do collaborative mind mapping, which my creative team find really useful. So there are all kinds of tools, yeah, I think there's lots more out there.
Thanks so much. So I think we have time for a few more.
I'm really sorry, I've got no idea if I answered it.
No, I'm trying to keep up whilst you're talking and trying to multitask a bit, but it's not so easy, and we will not be able to get through all of them. I'm really sorry. So I'm trying to kind of find common points. So one I found really interesting was that Jane was asking how to demonstrate the advantages of her dyslexia, because this is probably a room where people understand and can relate to it, but in a society that is maybe not that far yet. How do you kind of communicate those advantages?
I think about that so much, and I think about how it is measurable, but it takes some time and energy to measure it, and I don't know of anyone who's measuring it, because I thought myself about, should I try and do a PhD in this area and actually try to really, what I want to research is how many, as I touched on in the talk, how many successful creative entrepreneurs are actually dyslexic, and that would mean testing them, and because a lot of people, adults, don't know they're dyslexic, especially if they're my age and their school didn't believe in it. So I think that would be something that we could measure in quite a large sort of sample. But yeah, and annoyingly, I haven't got time for a PhD, but if someone else wants to do one, I think that'd be brilliant, isn't it? Do it to Lucy Cavendish. But yeah, no, I think really some research would be, I'm sure that people are doing research into dyslexia, and a lot of people get totally hung up in understanding it and solving it. In my opinion, there aren't enough people going, okay, this is a thing, let's not worry about why, let's not worry about what it is, let's look actually at how because a lot of people, for example, they'll try and train people to be entrepreneurs, and they'll think, oh, I know, I'll look at really clever people and then I'll see if I can train them to be entrepreneurs. And sometimes they can and sometimes they can't. What if we looked at it differently, and what if we thought, well, let's look at dyslexic people and see if we can talk to them about being entrepreneurs, see if we can give them whatever support they need, because maybe there's more of a correlation there. I think there's so much that could be done, but yeah, anyway, I digress. But yeah, the measuring of it, I think, is really interesting. I'd love to, there's probably some research out there in it. I'd love to know more about that research, but my experience, I did have a pretty good look a couple of years ago, and I couldn't find anything like enough.
We have good news. Oscar volunteered to do it when he's older.
Excellent.
So there's hope.
Now.
Then there's a very practical question. Maybe somebody else can answer that as well, which is Oscar's 12, so there is a bit of time still left.
Do that. That is brilliant. Are you dyslexic? You're going to solve it. You are going to be all over it. Love it, Oscar. Let me know if you want a private chat about it.
That's brilliant. Yeah, or maybe Oscar, if you want a private chat, maybe you can leave either send it to Lucy or don't put your message, your email in the chat, but maybe you can send it to the development office in a private message so we can connect you.
They're coming round.
Yeah. A very practical question is, how do you get dyslexia assessed?
Assessed.
Yes.
You can pay for it to be assessed. In my daughter's case, it's quite expensive because you have to have an educational psychologist do it. I think it cost about £650, which was terrifying. There are ways that you can get, there are tests. In fact, there's an app I did not so long ago, and again, it's by this guy Darius, and you can get assessed in a sort of more informal way on free. But to actually have a really thorough assessment, it usually costs some money. I don't know if there's support available for those who can't afford it, but in my experience there hasn't been, but I do think that there's in for example, a lot of state schools, the learning support will see the flags and be able to help parents with it. But what's great about having that full report done is it shows you exactly what bits, what help is needed, and makes very specific suggestions, which are really helpful.
There has been a lot of discussion about how schools can support dyslexic children, and that there's still this gap of not recognizing their value, and their gifts.
It's really hard, and again, in my narrow experience, my personal view at this point in time is that the state system is better at supporting dyslexia than the private education system. That's a very sweeping statement to make, but just from the stories I hear, everybody's working really hard to support dyslexia, and there's a lot of people supporting it extremely well in the private system, don't get me wrong, but I do think that that sometimes it's even better. It's done. I think that support is often done in the classroom in state schools rather than taking people out, which it can be, it's a matter of opinion what is better, because obviously in some ways it's better to take that child out and really work with them. But in my opinion, the act of taking a child out of the classroom for long periods of time and makes them feel different and makes their peers feel different, and sometimes that becomes a bigger issue than the dyslexia itself. So yeah, it depends how dyslexic you are, it depends on all sorts of things, but yeah, the support is amazing, and now I think it can be great to be diagnosed, because you do get this extra time in exams, and you do get these extra tools, and everyone's there to help you. It's just that the one big yucky problem with it all is the other kids and their parents. And sometimes your own parents mess it all up. And that's the problem. The teachers are doing amazing stuff. The kids are trying to keep positive, and the rest of society is just knocking them back, even now.
Yeah, you're doing an amazing job there. You also said you're giving talks in schools sometimes. So, I mean, that's really, you're helping changing that. So that's really amazing.
I'll see if I can fit it in.
Another question that I found really interesting. I'm sorry, I can't follow all of them now. So another one that I found really interesting was, how can we improve the communication between dyslexic and non-dyslexic people?
Well, yeah, and that again, I often find that when I talk to people one-to-one or in small groups who are very linear thinkers, I mean, I was in a meeting about a year ago with people that were saying, well, I'm throwing out all of these 5 CVs because they've all got spelling mistakes on them. And I said, and that is bad, because it is quite easy to get someone else to read a CV for you. But you know what? One of these CVs was beautifully laid out, and it only had 2 spelling mistakes on it. One of them was the wrong spelling of there, which frankly, many linear thinkers get wrong all the time, even on bloody newspapers. We're supposed to be able to write. And and I had to say to them, it depends on the role. Of course you're right. If you're interviewing for somebody that's got to write content on a website, you're fair enough, you don't want spelling mistakes on the CV. But if you're actually interviewing for a designer or computer programmer, you've got to think about what you're asking, because some people aren't in the mindset of getting someone else to check their CV. Anyway, I've forgotten what the question was now. I've just talked myself to a standstill. Sorry.
The communication between.
Oh yeah. And so I think there's a long way to go with it, actually, because I'm always really conscious that maybe, like in the talk I've just done, I was thinking as I was doing it, of course, I'm not trying to slag off linear thinkers. Gosh, we need those too, don't we? I just want to bring up, both of us together for everything to be equitable. And I do think that it's a lot to do with this looking at it as a disability. It depends on the individual as to how well linear and non-linear thinkers are communicating, and some really, really get it and think, great, especially, I don't want to be ageist, but especially older people who've come to really recognize that different people have different strengths, and thank goodness we're not all the same, or we'd be just awful. But I think it's one of those differences that people need to celebrate. I don't think everybody is yet.
That's absolutely true, and that everybody should work in changing that and go away from here and maybe have a bit of a Thanks so much for the talk and discussion. We have to close this now because it's already past 7. So the chat will be saved. We will send the chat. Thanks again, and that was really amazing. Thanks for doing that.
Thank you.